This is going to be a short series on the book of Matthew, looking at the theme of fulfillment in Jesus' life of the typologies and the prophecies of the Old Testament. Primarily, I'll be looking at the formula where Jesus is said specifically to be fulfilling something written by a prophet, but there are many other allusions to the Old Testament that will be touched on briefly as well. Although the entire Bible has the same divine author, the inspired human author of each gospel presents a unique portrait of Jesus, and they focus uniquely on theological themes of their own. Matthew is the most Jewish of the Gospels, and is possibly the most clearly linked to the Old Testament and to the Messianic prophecies. Professor of New Testament Mark Strauss writes, Matthew's central theme is promise and fulfillment. God's promises in the Hebrew Scriptures to bring salvation to his people Israel and to the whole world are being fulfilled with the coming of Jesus, the Messiah. This theme of fulfillment, he continues, permeates every page of the gospel. Whether we're discussing direct predictive prophecies or the type and antitype relationships, it would be impossible to find and discuss every instance in which Jesus fulfills what appears in the inspired writings of the Old Testament. Every element of Jesus' life in each of its stages is explicitly stated, either by the author Matthew or by Jesus himself, to be a fulfillment of an Old Testament promise. These include the introductory genealogy, the birth announcement, Jesus' home location, his sermons, his passion, and his resurrection. In most of these instances, in Matthew's Gospel, the fulfillment motif is specifically highlighted, and is especially so in a formula that states the version of the phrase, in order to fulfill. Mark Strauss's article, Matthew, Jesus is the Promised Messiah, states that, quote, these fulfillment formulas appear 10 times in the Gospel of Matthew, and they read something like, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. Strauss points out that there are another dozen or so citations or allusions to specific Old Testament passages that also highlight this fulfillment theme without exercising this exact formula. Although there are countless layers of fulfillment, this series is going to feature almost entirely on the explicit prophecies that conform to this one formula, or which use other explicit references to the written prophecies in the Old Testament. There are dozens of those instances, and one example would be Matthew's citation of Micah 5:2 and 5:5 to demonstrate that Jesus was to be born in Bethlehem. The answer as to where he would be born is found on the lips of the priests and teachers when Herod asks them where the Messiah is to be born. Quote, similarly, Matthew identifies John the Baptist as the one about whom it is written, and then he cites Malachi 3:1. Quoting again, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. These examples are still from Strauss's article. Examples like these could be multiplied from every section of the gospel, but these two give the flavor that we're talking about here. The fulfillment theme in Matthew and in Jesus' own teachings show the reader how to approach the Old Testament, as there are many instances where the inspired gospel applies prophecies to Jesus that don't appear to be messianic in their original context. A lot of times critics will claim that Matthew's using these out of context and misapplying them, but the inspired author, read in his context, actually shows us what it means that all of the Old Testament is fulfilled in Jesus. Here's another quote from Strauss. For example, in its original context, Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I called my son, was not a prophecy about the Messiah escaping to Egypt and then returning to Israel. In fact, it wasn't a prophecy at all, but rather a statement by God concerning his deliverance of Israel in the Exodus from Egypt. The use of this text, which isn't even prophetic in its context, demonstrates how typologies work. Matthew is teaching us that Jesus is the new Israel, so statements about Israel are fulfilled in Jesus, even though they aren't predictive prophecies in and of themselves. This demonstrates to us that fulfilling what was written in the scriptures does not require that the scriptures were presenting a prophecy about Jesus or about the Messiah. It means that what the scriptures are saying about Adam, Abraham, David, Israel, the suffering servant, the law, and sometimes even about Yahweh himself, are fulfilled in the life and ministry of Jesus. He's filling up what the Old Testament has been saying. This is the larger presentation of the Israel-Jesus typology, and this is evidenced also in Matthew's application of the servant passages to Jesus. In the Old Testament, there are instances of the servant typifying Israel, even in her failures, as well as the coming of Messiah. All of these examples, though, point to Jesus as fulfillment. The genealogy. The first two words of Matthew, Biblos Genesios, is a transliteration of the Greek phrase. Literally, this is the book of Genesis, and it communicates Matthew's theological purpose. Quoting G.K. Beale, The Temple and the Church's Mission, Matthew is indeed alluding to Genesis 2 and 5. This is enhanced by observing that these are the only two places in the entire Greek Old Testament where the phrase Biblos Genesios occurs. Matthew's point in using this phrase is to make clear that he is narrating the record of the new age, the new creation, launched by the coming death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This quote comes from Borden's Mintz lesson on Matthew. The genealogy of Matthew is notable in several ways. The first one is that Matthew is picking up with the genealogy right after the Hebrew Bible ends in Chronicles. Chronicles is list after list of genealogy, and Matthew is showing that he's writing scripture. He's continuing and fulfilling what the Old Testament was saying where it left off. Matthew's teachings are often divided into triads, and here we have a triad of genealogies, each one numbering a symbolic 14. David's name itself in Hebrew gematria is the number 14. And so this genealogy connecting Jesus first to Abraham, then to David, and then to the exile and the return is divided into sections of 14. It also references directly the book of Genesis. John does this explicitly when it starts its gospel saying, in the beginning, relating us right back to the beginning of the Hebrew scriptures. And Mark says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus, again putting us back at the beginning of Genesis. Matthew uses the word the book of Genesis to show us that that's where he's going as well. So Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, of Adam, of Abraham, of David, and of Israel itself. Following this genealogy of Jesus, which links Matthew to the book of Genesis and represents itself as the continuation of the Old Testament and the bringing of the new by its continuation from Chronicles, the birth narratives and subsequent verses provide the largest cluster of the fulfillment prophecies in this book. In chapter 2, these cite 3 different prophets with different degrees of prophetic prediction. As the narrative moves into chapter 3, the fulfillment of the prophecy points to John the Baptist, the forerunner, rather than to Jesus himself. In Matthew 2:5, we have Herod questioning the Magi. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Verse 14, "And he rose and took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt." Verse 15, "And remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son." That again is from Hosea 11:1. Verse 17 then says, "Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more." Verse 22. "But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee." Verse 23. "And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene." As mentioned in Matthew 3:1-3, the prophecy moves to John the Baptist. "In those days, John the Baptist came preaching in the wilderness of Judea, 'Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.' For this is he who was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah, when he said, 'The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight.'" We see that the formula changes in this chapter, and it does so in a very telling and sometimes controversial way. First, there's a triad of geographical prophecies, each attributed by a direct quote and the attribution to a single given prophet. Only the Isaiah prophecy, the first in this triad, is inarguably a prophecy about the Messiah. The next two, the Hosea and Jeremiah passages, aren't even clearly prophetic at all, let alone messianic. But Matthew is bringing them all together for a reason, and he's demonstrating that they're all fulfilled in Jesus. He reveals to us that they are, in fact, messianic predictors, and his final reference to Jesus fulfilling prophecy in this chapter shows us how they are linked in Jesus. When Matthew says that Jesus is called a Nazarene, he cites not one prophet, but the body of the Old Testament typologies under the rubric, quote, the prophets, not the prophet. Interestingly, there is no Old Testament prophecy that says that the Messiah is from Nazareth. That's not what is being prophesied, according to Matthew. The reference to Jesus being from Nazareth is the fact that explains why all the other passages are fulfilled in one man. Isaiah showed us that he is the Messiah from Bethlehem. This is accounted for with the census and the circumstances of his birth. Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem, and that's where Jesus was born. Then the slaughter of the innocents links Rachel's burial here at Bethlehem, where she weeps over the deaths of the infants, and transfers Jeremiah's reference to Ramah to this locale. Her presence as Israel's mother weeping, which foreshadows the sword in Mary's soul over the death of her son Israel, ties the flight from Bethlehem and the tragedy of it to the murders and captivity of Israel to Babylon in Jeremiah's poem. The poetry is operative in both contexts, in Jeremiah and here in Matthew, and we see the captivity and the rescue of Israel, along with the tragic murders and Israel's suffering in this context. Here Jesus is set up as the rescuer of Israel, as well as the suffering servant of the Old Testament. As Israel embodied, Jesus fulfills the Hosea call of the son from Egypt when Joseph flees there with his family. And when the family returns to Nazareth to raise Jesus, making him a Nazarene, the Isaiah prophecy of Matthew 5 is fulfilled, in that the Bethlehem Messiah, called out of Egypt, is also a light from Galilee. In Matthew 5:13 through 19, we read, "And leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned." Verse 19, "And he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.'" This main cluster of fulfillment formulas in the first narrative section is followed by the first discourse, the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew has been describing the ways that Jesus' birth and his introduction to the world have been in fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies and types. Framing his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus forms an inclusio with a discussion of this very law and prophets already spoken of. He introduces this main exhortation section of the sermon after describing kingdom life in the Beatitudes by confirming what Matthew has been presenting and by defining his mission. He has come to fulfill the law and the prophets, he says, not to abolish them. Centered in the Sermon on the Mount is the Lord's Prayer, in which he shows that the fulfillment is the coming of the kingdom, the forgiveness of sins, and our role in bringing these through faith and prayer. As he ends the section, he reminds the listeners of the Lord's Prayer petitions and reminds us that these teachings are a summation of the fulfillment of the law and prophets. These inclusios and chiasms are found as literary devices throughout and framing the whole of Matthew's gospel, including in the very discourses out of Jesus' mouth. The Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6:17 and 18, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Matthew 7:12 says, "So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets." Those two references in the sermon refer to the law and the prophets as inclusios.